Hey, what is going on, everybody? Welcome into this week's edition of my top starts and sits for week 15 of this fantasy football season, aka the first round of the fantasy football playoffs. So, obviously, if you're watching this video, that means you made the playoffs, so congratulations. But if you're watching this video and you unfortunately did not make the playoffs, as I've said all season long, with my top starts and sits, I do believe you, I know I do, anyways. You can take some of these names and factor them into your daily lineups. I factor them into my prop bets if I want to bet the over or the under on some players. So you can still utilize this information if you've been a fan of these videos this season and you just haven't happened to not make the playoffs. With that being said, before I dive into the video, as I said last night with my waiver wire video, I am a firm believer in that you should be playing the players that you believe got you to the fantasy playoffs. Now, there are going to be some names on here that I'm going to suggest as sits, and I do know some of these players may have gotten you to the fantasy playoffs. So, if they got you to the fantasy playoffs and you truly believe that, I do say play them. But if you maybe been swapping these players I will mention in this video with another player that helped you get to the fantasy playoffs, maybe you do want to consider playing that other player this weekend. With that being said, let's do what I always do. Start at the quarterback position. My top star of the week, he will be playing in that Thursday night matchup tomorrow night. Brock Purdy against the Rams. The Rams have allowed the eighth most fantasy points per game to the quarterback position this season. When these two teams met earlier this year, it was in the first 4 weeks, so you do want to factor that in. But Brock Purdy did finish with 292 passing yards and 3 touchdowns. Now, over the last 4 games for the Rams, they have allowed at least two quarterbacks to throw for 280 passing yards, and they've given up 7 passing touchdowns in those games. And another reason why I do like Brock Purdy is because Isaac Garendo is questionable for the game tomorrow night. It's a banged up backfield. I think even if Garendo plays with him being banged up, it would probably be a running back by committee. I think they're going to really lean into the passing attack in this matchup. I think also too with all the talk about how Deebo Samuel has struggled, I think they're going to manufacture touches for Deebo Samuel. And what that means is if they manufacture touches for him, that's going to be the quick screen game. And all it could take is, we've seen this in the past with Deebo, to take one screen to the house for like a 60-yard touchdown. So I think the game plan from Kyle Shanahan is going to benefit Purdy. So that's why he's my top start this week. My other top star, he definitely has kind of slowed down over these last few weeks in this losing streak for Arizona, but I like Kyler Murray to get back on track against the New England Patriots. New England is tied for the 10th most points per game allowed to quarterbacks this season. Now, I know normally I do look at the last 4 games, but just looking at the last 3 games for the Patriots, they've allowed two of the quarterbacks they faced in the last 3 games to throw for at least 295 passing yards. And then why I really like Kyler is in those 3 games, New England has given up 10 passing touchdowns. So I'm looking for him to finish with at least 2+ touchdowns and maybe even one on the ground, because one of those games was Anthony Richardson, who did have 2 rushing touchdowns on the ground. No, he had 1 rushing touchdown on the ground. He threw 2. I'm sorry about that. He ran in that 2-point conversion. Got a little confused on that. Anyways, moving into my sits, as I said, there might be some names of players that got you to the playoffs. So, Jaden Daniels is one of those, right? I am suggesting sitting Jaden Daniels against the Saints. Now, if you don't have a better option than Jaden Daniels, you're going to play him this week. He got you to the playoffs. I totally understand that. As far as daily lineups, this would be a name I would look to avoid this week. If you do play him in your fantasy playoffs, I would just temper my expectations that maybe he's not going to have one of those ceiling games that he has had at moments this season, for a few reasons. When you look at the matchup, New Orleans is allowing the 9th fewest points per game against the quarterback position. Now, the benefit is he could possibly get you at least passing yards. There have been 3 quarterbacks in their last 4 games to reach at least 225 passing yards against the Saints. But they've only given up 4 passing touchdowns in those games as well. And another factor why I think this might not be a great week for Jaden, outside of maybe not be able to, just because the Saints have only allowed basically 1 passing touchdown a game, is just because the Saints are more than likely, it sounds like Jake Haener is going to be the quarterback this weekend. This is a big game for the Commanders to continue their push to the playoffs. So couldn't you see the Commanders coming out hot and trying to blow out the Saints early, especially against a backup quarterback. At any point in this game, if the Commanders go up 2+ touchdowns, what is that going to do? They're just going to hand the ball off to Brian Robinson Jr. and Chris Rodriguez. So I just could see the game script not going his way, and if the game script doesn't go his way and he doesn't get you at least 2 touchdowns early in the game, he could possibly have a floor outcome. But again, I understand Jaden probably got you the playoffs, so I understand why you'd want to play him. My other sit, this has been a streaming option throughout the season. If you're considered streaming Matthew Stafford against the Niners in that game tomorrow night, I would be hesitant to do that. For a couple, I found some stats on it, but anyways, San Francisco is allowing the 10th fewest points per game against quarterbacks this season. In the first matchup this season, he threw for 221 yards and only had 1 touchdown in that game. In the last 4 games that Matthew Stafford has played the 49ers, he only has 3 passing touchdowns, and he also has 3 interceptions. So he's not even averaging a touchdown a game against them in their last 4 matchups. He actually has not thrown for 2 touchdowns against San Francisco since January 9th of 2022. And then, as you guys do know, I like to look at their last 4 games. The last 4 games for San Francisco, only 1 quarterback threw over 200 passing yards against their defense. But the benefit is they have given up 6 passing touchdowns in those games. But like I said, he hasn't thrown for at least 2 passing touchdowns against San Francisco since I think that was the playoff matchup back in 2022. Moving into my starts and sits at the running back position, my top start of the week, I am going to go with a running back for Dallas who's been very hot over this past month, Rico Dowdle against the Panthers. Panthers have allowed the most points per game against running backs this season. I like it because they're not giving up touchdowns. They've only given up 2 running back touchdowns over the last 4 games, but they're giving up a ton of yards on the ground. They've actually allowed 5 different running backs to finish with at least 75 total yards in their last 4 games, so that's the biggest reason why I do like Rico in the first round of the playoffs. Staying in that matchup, I like the other running back in that matchup for Carolina, Chuba Hubbard against the Cowboys. Cowboys have allowed the 3rd most points per game against running backs this season. In their last 4 games, 2 different running backs have finished with at least 100 total yards. And then they also been giving up some touchdowns. They've given up 5 running back touchdowns in those games. So yeah, those guys are my top 2 starts. My top sits, guy that definitely has not really came through if you stashed him on the IR. I know I did in one league. But Nick Chubb against the Chiefs, he does have a tough matchup. Going against Kansas City, he's allowed the fewest points per game against the running back position. Only 1 running back finished over 60 rushing yards against Kansas City in their last 4 games, as that rookie running back for Las Vegas, Sincere McCormick. But they have given up 4 running back touchdowns in their last 4 games, so I do think Nick Chubb is a touchdown or bust option for you if you had to slide him maybe into your flex spot this weekend. Another name, I know I probably just because of my injuries, because I have Breece Hall in a league and with DeAndre Swift, so I'm probably going to have to play DeAndre Swift this week. I understand if you want to play him too, because DeAndre Swift did have some big games. He did help me get to the playoffs. But if you do have a better option than DeAndre Swift, I would consider it. But yeah, my other sit is DeAndre Swift against the Vikings. The Vikings are tied for the 3rd fewest points per game against running backs this season. In their first matchup, he only had 65 total yards and 0 touchdowns, so that's not ideal, especially if he doesn't get you a touchdown this weekend. And then in their last 4 games, only 1 running back finished over 70 rushing yards against their defense. He happens to be one of the better running backs in the league, Bijan Robinson. And they've only given up 3 running back touchdowns in their last 4 games as well. Moving into my top starts and sits for the wide receiver position. My top start, he definitely has been quiet since he blew up earlier in this season, but he's still kind of been consistent with at least the catches, right, and about 60 yards a game. But I think Malik Nabers is finally going to have that boom spot this weekend against the Ravens. The Ravens have allowed the most points per game against wide receivers this season. In their last 4 games, there have been at least 3 wide receivers to finish with at least 80 receiving yards, and they've only given up 4 wide receiver touchdowns. But they've been giving up the yards. They've been giving up the most points per game. And why I also like Malik Nabers is a game script opportunity, because this Giants team is terrible, right? So can you not see Baltimore going up 2+ touchdowns in the first half at some point? So what is that going to do? That's going to make the Giants have to throw the ball a lot, which is going to create a volume of opportunity for Malik Neighbors to get targets in this matchup, which is why I like for him to finally get across 100 yards for the first time, I think, since like September. My other top starts, it's a trio of wide receivers for Chicago: DJ Moore, Keenan Allen, and Rome Odunze against the Vikings. The Vikings are tied for the second most points per game against the wide receiver position. In the first matchup, maybe the first matchup stats don't want you to start Odunze, but in that first matchup, DJ Moore had 106 receiving yards and a touchdown. Keenan Allen had 86 yards and a touchdown. Odunze only had 39 yards, but you think that could balance out. Odunze did come off that 2-touchdown performance against San Francisco this past Sunday. And then why I also like it is Minnesota's been giving up a lot of yards over their last 4 games. 5 different wide receivers have finished with at least 85 receiving yards against Minnesota, and they've given up 4 wide receiver touchdowns in those 4 games as well. Moving into my sits. Brandon Cooks against the Panthers. I know Cooks has caught a couple touchdowns over the past couple weeks, so maybe you might be thinking about streaming him this week. That's why I threw his name out there as a hesitant to stream him at your wide receiver position, because Carolina is actually tied for the 8th fewest points per game against wide receivers this year. It's because all the points are funneling to the running back and the tight end position. Just spoiled my next section as one of my top starts. With that being said, though, in their last 4 games, only one wide receiver finished over 55 receiving yards, and that was Mike Evans. If there's going to be a guy that crosses 55 receiving yards, it's probably going to be CeeDee Lamb. And then they've also only have given up 3 wide receiver touchdowns in those 4 games as well. Moving into my sits. Now, I told you there's going to be some names where I'm going to say, hey, there's going to be some players here that might have gotten you to playoffs. If you believe this player got you to playoffs, I understand why you're going to play him. I'm probably going to have to play him in one of my leagues because I don't have a better option for me. So I'm just going to temper my expectations. But yeah, Zay Flowers and Rashad Bateman too, who has been playable throughout the season against the Giants. The Giants are actually tied for the 9th fewest points per game against the wide receiver position. In their last 4 games, the most receiving yards a wide receiver finished with, which was 68 receiving yards, which was Mike Evans as well. And then also too, they've only given up 1 wide receiver touchdown in those 4 games as well. And I think it's also too because Giants have lost their best defensive player in Dexter Lawrence, so teams are starting to run the ball heavily against them. So as I've been talking about this video game script, right? So, I think this is going to be a very run-heavy attack with Derrick Henry because without Dexter Lawrence, I think you're going to see Derrick Henry and Lamar Jackson take over on the ground. As I talked about with Malik Neighbors, right, you can see Baltimore blowing out the Giants by halftime. At least I can. And if that happens, and if they're up 2 to 3 touchdowns by halftime, and if Zay Flowers does not have you 100 yards by then, doesn't have you 50 yards and a touchdown, it's plausible he's not going to get a lot of targets in the second half of the game. It's not his fault. It's just that they're playing a very bad team who also just happens to the teams run all over them. So wide receivers aren't having big fantasy performances against them as well. Again, I understand why you might play Zay. Zay might have got you to playoffs. He helped me get to the playoffs in leagues. But so I understand playing him, just temper your expectations. But if you do have leagues where you've been swapping out Zay, because Zay's been like 1 week he goes off, next week he's quiet, right? So if you have been doing that with Zay, I would consider the other guy if he has a better matchup this weekend. Moving into my top starts and sits at the tight end position, as I kind of spoiled talking to you guys about sitting Brandon Cooks because all the points, fantasy points when offenses play Carolina go to the running back and tight end, which is why I also do like Jake Ferguson against the Panthers. The Panthers are allowing the most points per game against tight ends this season. In their last 4 games, they have allowed 2 tight ends to finish with at least 60 receiving yards. In those 4 games, they have given up 3 tight end touchdowns. And just looking at the season as a whole, the Carolina Panthers are the only team in the NFL that have allowed double-digit touchdowns to the tight end position. They've given up 10 touchdowns to tight ends this year. My other start, he definitely has been a disappointment. Throughout his career. I know he's out there on waivers, and in one league, I just have to stream tight ends, and I'm rolling the dice on him because of this matchup. And I think Kirk Cousins and this passing attack is going to get right on track against this Raiders defense, who has struggled to defend the passing attack over this past month and a half. With that being said, I do like Kyle Pitts against the Raiders. Raiders have allowed the third most points per game against tight ends this season. In their last 4 games alone, they have allowed 4 different tight ends to finish with at least 55 receiving yards. They have given up 2 tight end touchdowns in those 4 games. And then when you look at the season, they have allowed 7 tight end touchdowns, which is tied for the third most in the NFL. So those are my reasons why I do like taking a chance on Kyle Pitts this weekend. My sit. Now this might be he's had his up and down games, right? And so I would understand. And honestly, at this point of the season, like unless you're not going to pick up maybe you could stream a Kyle Pitts because he might be out there on the waiver wires. I understand why you might have to play a Sam Laporta, but I do not like his matchup this weekend because Sam Laporta is going against the Bills, who have allowed the third fewest points per game against tight ends this season. In their last 4 games, the most receiving yards a tight end has finished with was 23 receiving yards, and that was Noah Gray. Now, they have given up 2 tight end touchdowns in those games. Both of those touchdowns went to Noah Gray. So if Laporta plays, he gets you 25 yards and 2 touchdowns. I mean, you're not going to complain. But to factor in that they've those 2 touchdowns, right? When you look at the whole season, Buffalo has only given up 3 touchdowns to tight ends this season. So they've been very good at defending the tight end position and keeping them out of the end zone for the most part, which is why I don't like Laporta in this first round. My other sit, I am going to go with Hunter Henry against the Cardinals. I know he's been a solid streaming option, especially with Drake May at the quarterback position, who has been heavily targeting him this since he's taken over. But he does have a rough matchup this weekend. Arizona is allowing the 5th fewest points per game against tight ends this season. In Arizona's last 4 games, the most receiving yards one tight end has finished with was 28 receiving yards, and that was TJ Hawkinson. And looking at their season as a whole, Arizona has only allowed tight ends to score 2 touchdowns against them so far through the first 14 games. So yeah. Wait, did I do that right? 14, 6, no, first 13 games. I'm sorry. So only 2 tight end touchdowns in 13 games. So that's another reason why I don't like Hunter Henry this weekend. So yeah, guys, those are my top starts and sits for the first round of the fantasy football playoffs. I wish you guys the best of luck to go ahead and make it to the second round. Actually, hopefully you guys made it. You got a first round bye, right? Ideally. With that being said, as I always say, enjoy this video. Hit the like button. If you're not followed or subscribed to me on my social media platforms, you can mainly find me on X. That's where I'm the most active, where you can really reach me. I am hit and miss on my other platforms, to be honest. As far as TikTok, I'm on there, Instagram, and my YouTube channel as well. And as always, guys, I wish you guys a great night, evening, morning, whenever you're watching this. You guys will still get my waiver wire video and streamable defenses next Tuesday, so that's when you'll see me next. Peace out.